All right, in this chapter, we are talking about the reproductive system. So, again, we're going to focus mostly on the anatomy and touch only a little bit on the physiology. We will go into a bit more detail than normal with the physiology, though, because it doesn't get covered in immense detail in most physiology classes, but we are still focused primarily on anatomy. Before we get into all of this anatomy and stuff, there are a few important notes that I want to cover really quickly. So we're focusing on the characteristics of people who fit kind of neatly into our standard definitions of typical anatomy for somebody who has two X chromosomes or is considered to be biologically female, and somebody who has an X and a Y chromosome who would be biologically male. So this biological sex is based on the makeup of chromosomes, whereas gender is more of a social idea. And so these are two very different things. We have used them interchangeably in the past, and that's not necessarily accurate. And many people do still use that, either because they don't know, they're ignorant of that information, or it just doesn't matter to them that much. So I do want to address that really quickly here, though, that biological sex and gender are two separate things. There are a lot of differences in sex chromosomes even within that. Most people are going to have either two X chromosomes or an X and a Y chromosome, but there are mutations that can happen leading to a bunch of different variations in this with extra chromosomes of either X or Y or fewer than what are supposed to be there. So that can have a big impact on an individual's anatomy and function. And then there are also intersex people who have any potential combination of the anatomical features that we're going to cover this week in this chapter. And so they are a smaller percentage of the population, but not as small as most people think. The official estimate is that about 2% of the population is intersex, which is about the same frequency of redheads. So there's about 2% of the population will have red hair. So that's a lot more common than you would think in and of itself. But on top of that, more recent estimates are suggesting that this is actually far more common than 2% of the population, because that 2% is based off of people who had something that was functioning a little bit differently, and so they got checked out medically, or things that are really, really obvious. But there are a lot of people who are intersex and go their entire lives without knowing it, because that feature, that fact, does not have any impact on their day-to-day functioning, does not force them to seek treatment for any reason, so they may go their entire lives without knowing. All right, but for the purposes of this chapter, I'm primarily going to use people with two X chromosomes, people with two Y chromosomes, female, male, to refer to individuals that fit into these kind of traditional categories. And sometimes you'll also see these referred to as individuals who have ovaries or individuals who have testes. But again, that's not always going to be true necessarily. All right, so there are some similarities in that both reproductive systems are going to have gonads, they're going to make gametes, they've got tubes and pathways for moving those gametes around, and there are permanent sterilization options for both. So in people who have an X and a Y chromosome, they're going to have testes that make sperm. The tube or pathway that gamete, the sperm, are going to follow is the vas deferens, also known as the ductus deferens. And so a vasectomy is a removal of a section of this tube to prevent sperm from passing through. Whereas in people who have two X chromosomes, they are going to have ovaries that make ova, or eggs, and then they have the oviduct, also known as the uterine tube or fallopian tubes. And so a tubal ligation is a similar procedure to the vasectomy. They're going to go in and remove part of that tube in order to prevent the movement of that gamete into the rest of the reproductive system. So we saw this image when we looked at the bladder in the previous chapter. But this is just kind of a quick overview. So the structures do end up looking a lot different, but there's more similarities than you would imagine, and we'll touch on that at the end of the chapter when we talk about how the reproductive systems develop. All right, so the focus of this video is going to be on the anatomy of the male reproductive system. So we're looking at individuals who would have properly functioning X and Y chromosomes, have testes, and are making sperm cells. So their job is, again, to produce those sperm cells and then deliver those to the female's reproductive tract for actual reproduction and creation of offspring. We'll go into this a lot more detail in lab as well, but just to kind of touch bases here. So this is a sagittal cross section. We've got the bladder right here, this round structure. The penis is going to be spongy tissue that can fill with blood, mostly located outside of the body, as well as the scrotum, which will have the testes and the first part of that tube system. Those are all stored outside of the body. We'll touch on why in a little bit. And then we have the vas deferens, which is this tube that runs up into the body around the backside of the bladder and will connect into the urethra for final delivery of sperm. And then there's some accessory glands found in here as well. Externally, something that we will briefly touch on in lab, but not in too much detail because we don't have really good representation of this, is the presence or absence of the prepuce or foreskin. So that will be present if an individual is uncircumcised, but circumcision removes that piece of tissue and just leaves the rest of the penis exposed. There's different reasons for doing this, from religious to just kind of societal standards. Some countries it's really, really common, like here in the US, it's very common to have this procedure done, whereas other countries it's very uncommon to have it done regularly. And there's, I guess you could say, pros and cons to each, but it's ultimately, I think, should be up to the individual, but that's a slightly different discussion to be having. So we're going to move on. So the scrotum is a skin-covered, very pigmented, so lots of coloration, lots of that melanin pigment, and it is muscular. That's really important for temperature regulation. The testes are located inside of it, and this keeps them about 2 to 4 degrees cooler than body temperature, which is what is necessary to create sperm properly. So those sperm cells do need a slightly lower temperature than what our body sits at to have them be fully intact and functioning properly. So these muscles in the scrotum are going to be able to contract and pull the scrotum up closer to the body in case the temperature needs to increase a little bit. So we have the dartos muscle and the cremaster muscles are all going to help do that. And then there is something called raphe in the middle that is going to separate the left and right sides and basically keep the testes separate from each other. So here's that line, that connective tissue down the middle. If we kind of remove some of this outer layer of skin, then we can see some of these muscles, and there is more of that connective tissue there in the middle, keeping the two testes separate from each other. Further removing those muscle layers and other connective tissue, we can see the actual testes themselves. The epididymis sits on top of them. That's where sperm finish maturing. And then it's also going to enter into that vas deferens that's going to travel up what's called the spermatic cord, along with the blood vessels in here, some nerves, and lymphatic vessels and stuff like that are all going to be found in that spermatic cord. Testes, there are normally going to be 2 of them. They're located again inside of the scrotum. They are making sperm cells as well as the typically male hormones. These are collectively referred to as androgens. The biggest one is testosterone. It's the most well known, but there are others. And it's not fully accurate to call these male hormones because all individuals, regardless of chromosome makeup, will create some level of all of these different hormones that we're going to touch on in this chapter. Testes are covered by some connective tissue, so we've got a serous membrane and then some more connective tissue, and that's going to be a lot denser to really kind of keep everything together and keep them protected. They are divided into up to 400 lobules, so just kind of sections within them, and those lobules are going to contain seminiferous tubules, which is where sperms start developing. So they've got specialized cells that are going to help create those sperm cells for support, and then the actual germ cells or stem cells that will ultimately develop into sperm. And then from those seminiferous tubules, sperm cells will move into some straight tubules, and then another region called the radi testis, and then the efferent ductule, and then the epididymis, where they finish out their maturation process. So here's again a zoomed in view. So we've cut back this muscle and some of these outer layers of that connective tissue that we can see here. So this would be a lobule in the testis with seminiferous tubules inside. Then you can see we've got these tube systems that kind of all ultimately fuse into that epididymis. And then that will transition into the vas deferens or ductus deferens to transport the fully matured sperm up through the rest of the reproductive tract. I almost said respiratory system. I don't know why. They both start with an R. So spermatogenesis is the process of creating sperm cells. This process will start at puberty. An entire cycle to mature a single sperm cell is going to take about 64 days, but this is happening continuously, and there are a lot of places where this is going to happen. So this is asynchronously occurring in the seminiferous tubules. So asynchronously means that not all of the cells are developing at the exact same time or the exact same rate, and that's important for fertility. So the spermatogonia, or germ cells or stem cells, they are going to sit along the basement membrane of those seminiferous tubules, so that connective membrane. They will divide via mitosis initially into a primary spermatocyte, and then that spermatocyte will divide in through meiosis to a secondary spermatocyte, which will then further divide in meiosis 2 to actual spermatids. And we'll see a graphic of this here in a little bit. So the maturation of sperm, so actually getting them into their final state, occurs near the seminiferous tubules, but not in them. And so the spermatids will change by reducing their cytoplasm, so they'll get rid of a lot of their cytoplasm and form the remaining parts of true sperm cells. And at that point, they become spermatozoa and then move to the epididymis for their final stage of maturation. So here's our flow chart. So spermatogonia, or stem cells, divide by mitosis. So we still have 46 chromosomes in each of these cells here in the primary spermatocytes. And then meiosis 1 splits that number of chromosomes in half. So we go from 46 to 23 in these resulting cells because we didn't go through that chromosome DNA replication process again, because we need half of that genetic material ending up in the final sperm cells so that they can combine with the egg cells, which also have half of the total number of chromosomes. So we've got that first step of meiosis, splitting that chromosome number in half, and then each of those cells will go through meiosis 2, keeping that number of chromosomes, so we're not further dividing the chromosomes. Those chromosomes will get replicated and then split into those remaining spermatids at that final stage of the mitosis and meiosis process. And then we go through spermiogenesis, which is transitioning from spermatids into fully formed spermatozoa or actual sperm cells. So here's a cross section of those seminiferous tubules. So basically looking down a tube. So this is where we're going to have a little bit of an opening. We've got these Sertoli cells, which are going to help with some support. Leydig cells also in here. So those cells are all going to either help with sperm support as they develop or hormone production. And then out here we also see a lot of those early spermatids, and they start dividing, and as they divide they get closer and closer into the lumen so that they can transition into the next set of tubes and ultimately the epididymis. So sperm cells are significantly smaller than egg cells. An individual will produce millions per day, up to 300 million per day. There is a head with what's called an acrosome, and then the chromosomes, and then there is a midpiece that contains mitochondria for energy, and then a tail or flagella for movement. So this is what those sperm cells look like. So here's the head with the acrosome on the outside. That's going to contain some enzymes for fertilization, so getting into the egg. The nucleus is still in here, so that's where all the chromosomes are going to be. Our midpiece is packed with mitochondria because these sperm cells need to be able to move. They need to be able to power this tail or the flagella for movement to get through the different sets of reproductive organs to find an actual egg to fertilize. So we're going to follow the pathway of sperm through the body from the epididymis out the body. So it goes from the epididymis to the vas deferens or ductus deferens, into the ejaculatory duct, and then the urethra. So the epididymis is again where sperm are going to finish maturing. By the time they reach the end of the epididymis, they can swim entirely on their own. They do not need the smooth muscle in the tube walls to move them forward. Takes them about 12 days to move through the epididymis. And again, we just went over the anatomy of sperm, but the anatomy of the epididymis looks very, very similar. As you can see, we've got a head, body, and tail. So the head is the starting point. By the time they reach the tail, they are fully formed and able to move on their own. Ductus deferens or vas deferens, again, is a tube with smooth muscle. It will help propel the sperm out of the body during ejaculation. So this does, again, start in the scrotum, travels up that spermatic cord with nerves, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, through the inguinal canal into the abdomen, and it will end at the posterior side of the urinary bladder, where it starts connecting with some other accessory glands. So semen is a mixture of sperm and other secretions from some sets of glands. So we have two seminal vesicles, a prostate gland, and then two bulbourethral glands, also known as Cowper's glands. So the seminal vesicles sit on the backside of the bladder. They have the first set of secretion added. It has a lot of fructose in it to provide energy for the sperm cells, and it's making up most of semen. And so the seminal vesicles are going to merge with the ejaculatory duct. We'll see some images of that both here in the lecture slides and in the lab. Prostate gland is roughly the size of a walnut. It's got some muscle tissues in it. It sits below the urinary bladder, surrounding the urethra. It's going to secrete a very alkaline fluid, which is going to basically help keep the sperm in good condition as they pass through the rest of the reproductive tract. So it will actually coagulate them first and kind of thicken that up. And then once it reaches the female reproductive system, it will decoagulate them so that they are able to move freely again. So again, that urethra runs through the center of it. There's a condition called benign prostatic hypertrophy that is common, especially in elderly individuals who are going to have a prostate gland. The hypertrophy is basically, it starts growing, so this isn't cancerous, that's why it's benign, but the cells in here will start growing. They can start pinching off the urethra, making urination difficult. There's not a ton of great treatment options for it, but it can kind of be managed a bit to keep it from getting worse. And then there is prostatic cancer or prostate cancer. This is the second most common cancer found in individuals who are going to have a prostate. Interestingly, it's actually not treated all of the time because it usually appears later in life in a lot of individuals, and in many cases, trying to treat this cancer is going to cause a worse quality of life for those individuals than it would be beneficial to them at the end of their life. And there's a very, very good chance that for some people they will pass away from other causes before the cancer would actually have a chance to cause any sort of issues like that. The bulbourethral glands, or Cowper's glands, these sit kind of below the prostate gland. They are going to have some very salty lubricating secretions that are going to help kind of clean out urine from the urethra before the sperm actually pass through, because urine is going to be very toxic to the sperm. But there can be some sperm cells in here, which is why pregnancy can occur even if full ejaculation did not actually happen, because there can still be sperm in these earlier secretions. So here's a front view of the reproductive system. So here's the bladder, prostate gland sits below it. Seminal vesicles are going to sit kind of back behind the bladder. They're just represented in a slightly different place. This is going to be the ejaculatory duct right here, kind of coming through the prostate. Bulbourethral gland sitting below that, right before the spongy tissue of the actual penis starts. So the penis is the main organ of copulation. So for intercourse, there are 3 columns of erectile tissue. The corpus cavernosa, there are 2 of these. They're very large. And then the corpus spongiosum, which is much smaller. The urethra will run through this. And then most of it is called the body of the penis. And then the glans is the end. It's at the very tip. It has most nerves in it. So very, very high concentration of nerves. And then the foreskin or prepuce would cover all of that, depending on whether or not circumcision would have taken place. So this vasocongestion is basically increased blood flow into these columns of spongy erectile tissue, which is what causes that erection. So again, we've got some side views here, so lateral, sagittal views, and then the transverse view, so you can better visualize the spongy tissue. So this is all corpus spongiosum here that the urethra is passing through. This would be corpus cavernosum. It's better visualized here again. So here we can see the 2 corpus cavernosa columns and the corpus spongiosum. And then that prepuce again would sit over the glands. We are going to continue talking about testosterone in the next video.